Welcome to the Beware Collectivism podcast. This podcast is designed as an analytical resource for students, policymakers, researchers, and informed citizens who seek to understand the wide-ranging consequences of the political and ideological movement broadly referred to as woke progressivism. Over the past 2 decades, this movement has expanded from university campuses into every major sphere of public life: corporate boardrooms, government agencies, school curricula, media institutions, and international policy bodies. The central argument of this podcast is not that compassion, environmental stewardship, or equal opportunity are unworthy goals. Rather, it is that the specific policy mechanisms chosen by the progressive movement to advance these goals, regulatory mandates, government subsidies, identity-based resource allocation, speech restrictions, and central economic planning, carry enormous and frequently ignored costs: economic costs, costs to individual liberty, costs to institutional trust, and costs to the social fabric of free societies. Each episode examines a distinct dimension of this phenomenon, drawing on economic data, historical precedent, and comparative policy analysis from multiple countries. Readers are encouraged to evaluate the evidence independently, weigh competing interpretations, and arrive at their own conclusions about the proper relationship between government power, collective goals, and individual freedom. The questions raised here: how much power should governments hold over private economic decisions? Who defines equity, and who enforces it? What is the true cost of carbon zero mandates on working families? Are among the most important questions a free society can ask. This podcast is an attempt to ask them seriously. Defining the movement, origins, and core tenets of woke ideology. What is woke ideology? The term woke originated in African American vernacular as a call to social awareness, particularly regarding racial injustice. Over time, it was adopted by a broader academic and activist movement and expanded into an encompassing ideological framework. By the 2010s and 2020s, woke ideology had come to denote a distinct cluster of beliefs and policy preferences centered on systemic inequality, identity group politics, and the view that virtually all disparate social outcomes are the product of structural oppression. At its core, woke ideology holds several foundational premises. Society is fundamentally structured by systems of power that privilege certain groups: white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, wealthy, while oppressing others. Individual achievement, merit, and personal responsibility are largely myths that serve to obscure these systemic inequalities. Traditional institutions, family, church, market economy, national sovereignty, are instruments of oppression that must be dismantled or transformed. Government must actively intervene to produce equitable outcomes, not merely guarantee equal opportunity. Language, speech, and culture are battlegrounds where power is contested and must be regulated accordingly. Ideological roots, from critical theory to mainstream policy. The intellectual foundations of woke ideology trace primarily to the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which emerged in Weimar-era Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. Thinkers like Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, and Theodor Adorno developed a neo-Marxist framework that replaced the traditional Marxist focus on economic class with a broader critique of culture, rationality, and liberal institutions. When these scholars emigrated to the United States to escape National Socialism, their ideas took root in American academia. By the 1970s and 1980s, critical theory had evolved into critical race theory, CRT, post-colonial theory, feminist theory, and queer theory, each offering a distinct group identity analysis of power and oppression. These frameworks gained institutional dominance in humanities and social science departments throughout elite universities. By the 1990s and 2000s, they were embedded in teacher education programs, ensuring they would flow into K-12 schooling. By the 2010s, they had migrated into corporate HR departments, government agencies, and mainstream media outlets. Key concept: critical theory versus liberal thought. Traditional liberalism holds that individual rights, free markets, and neutral institutions create the conditions for human flourishing. Critical theory rejects this framework, arguing that neutral institutions are never neutral. They encode the preferences of dominant groups. This distinction is foundational. It explains why woke progressivism sees deregulation as oppression, free speech as violence, and merit-based standards as instruments of racism. The 5 pillars of contemporary woke policy. While woke ideology is ideologically diverse, its policy expression tends to cluster around 5 major pillars. Pillar 1. Equity over equality. Traditional liberalism prizes equality of opportunity, the guarantee that all individuals face the same rules and have access to the same legal rights. Woke ideology replaces this with equity, defined as equality of outcomes across demographic groups. Where disparities in representation, wealth, or achievement exist between groups, they are presumed to reflect systemic discrimination rather than differences in individual choices, effort, or circumstances. The remedy is active government redistribution and preferential treatment. Pillar 2. Diversity and inclusion as compulsory values. Diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) programs mandate that institutions achieve demographic representativeness across racial, gender, sexual orientation, and other identity categories. This extends from hiring and admissions decisions to procurement, contract awards, investment mandates, and board composition requirements. Critics argue these programs substitute identity group membership for individual merit as the primary criterion for selection and advancement. Pillar 3. Environmental progressivism. Climate change is treated within the woke framework not merely as a technical policy problem, but as a moral emergency requiring the dismantling of fossil fuel-based economies and the reconstruction of global energy, transportation, agriculture, and manufacturing around state-directed green alternatives. The proposed remedies, such as the Green New Deal, involve unprecedented levels of government control over private economic activity. Pillar 4. Speech regulation and anti-hate frameworks. Woke ideology maintains that certain speech is inherently harmful and constitutes a form of violence against marginalized groups. On this basis, it supports speech codes on campuses, deplatforming on social media, hate speech laws, and professional and social sanctions against those who express views deemed offensive. Critics argue this creates an ideological monoculture that suppresses legitimate dissent and debate. Pillar 5. Anti-institutionalism and deconstruction. Woke ideology views many foundational institutions, the police, the nuclear family, organized religion, the meritocratic university, the free market, as instruments of oppression requiring fundamental transformation or abolition. Movements such as defund the police, critiques of the patriarchy, and attacks on white dominant culture in mathematics and science education all reflect this deconstruction impulse.